What if everything you've been told since childhood about the world, its pain, its chaos, and its endless struggle was not a tragic accident, but a deliberate inversion designed to turn your perception against you? What if the God you were taught to worship was never the true source at all, but a clever impostor, a false architect shaping the very prison you were told to call creation? That quiet discomfort you've carried for as long as you can remember, that sense that something doesn't quite add up, what if it was never doubt but recognition? You felt it every time you tried to follow the rules and still ended up losing, every time suffering, division, and greed were explained away as part of a perfect plan that never felt whole. How could a flawless divine source produce a world built on fear, hierarchy, and endless conflict? You're not imagining this, and you're not alone. Ancient Gnostic traditions spoke openly about this deception and gave it a name: the Demiurge, a manipulator of the material realm, obsessed with order and control, a false creator who mistook its limited power for absolute authority, a jailer wearing the mask of a king. And here's the part most people were never meant to hear: this being has no true power of its own. It survives through your ignorance, through your forgetfulness, through your disconnection from the divine spark within you. And so, if you stay with that feeling, the quiet realization that something about this world has never fully made sense, you arrive at a threshold where ordinary explanations begin to feel thin, and a deeper question starts to breathe beneath them. What if the story of reality itself has been carefully edited? What if what you call history, religion, and order is only the surface of something far older, something deliberately obscured? There are moments when it feels as if a curtain has been drawn just slightly aside, enough for you to sense that another version of the past is standing right behind the one you were taught. Not a different past meant to replace what you know, but a shadowed archive that was never meant to be opened. Long before modern religions hardened into institutions and doctrines, there were scattered circles of seekers across Egypt, Greece, Persia, and the Levant. Quiet communities, bound not by power or conquest, but by an unsettling intuition that the visible world was not the highest reality. These mystery schools were not interested in comfort. They guarded a dangerous idea, one that could loosen the grip of empires and unsettle the authority of gods made in human image. That the ruler of this world might not be the ultimate source at all. They spoke in symbols, myths, and coded stories, not because they loved secrecy for its own sake, but because direct speech was rarely safe. Their whispers suggested that what most people worshipped as the creator was closer to a craftsman than an origin, a shaper of matter rather than the wellspring of life itself. The ancient Greek word they used was demiurgos, a builder, a maker of forms. In the philosophical writings attributed to Plato, this figure appears almost gentle, a cosmic artisan arranging chaos into order, neither evil nor divine, simply doing its work. But in the inner teachings preserved by Gnostic traditions, the image darkens and sharpens. Here, the demiurge is no longer neutral. It becomes a flawed ruler, limited, arrogant, and unaware of anything beyond its own domain, mistaking its partial authority for absolute dominion. They gave it names heavy with meaning: Yaldabaoth, the blind god, the lion-faced serpent, not as literal monsters, but as mythic mirrors reflecting a consciousness that could create structure but not wisdom, law but not love. This figure, they said, did not emerge from the true source directly. It arose from a fracture, an echo, a distortion, and from that distortion came a world defined by separation, hierarchy, and control. Over time, another layer was woven into this story, one written not only in texts, but in the sky itself. The demiurge became symbolically entwined with Saturn, known to the ancients as Kronos, the keeper of time. Saturn was not feared because it was evil in a simple sense. It was feared because it represented limits, boundaries, and the cold certainty of duration. It measured days, devoured moments, and locked spirit into form with the quiet authority of inevitability. In its harshest aspect, Saturn was the voice that said, "This is as far as you go," the force that crystallized movement into structure and life into weight. This was not the Saturn of modern self-help astrology, softened into a teacher of discipline and patience. This was Saturn as the great binder, the power that turns flow into stone through time and entropy. Ancient cultures sensed this weight intuitively, which is why Saturn was associated with lead, the densest and most restrictive of metals, heavy, dull, slow to transform. In Gnostic symbolism, this Saturnian quality became inseparable from the Demiurge itself, dense, gravitational, perfectly suited to keep consciousness embedded in matter, convinced that the visible world was all there ever was. And here the story takes a turn that is harder to look away from. Across centuries, the energy of this archetype was fed again and again, sometimes openly, sometimes unknowingly. Through temples and altars, through vows sworn in fear and blood spilled in certainty, devotion flowed into the same symbolic current. From the monumental rituals of antiquity to the holy wars of the medieval world, from grand crusades where opposing armies were each convinced they served the true God, to the quiet, repetitive rituals practiced week after week under sacred banners, something was being reinforced. The form changed, the names shifted, but the current returned to the same throne. The Gnostics saw this as the most elegant deception imaginable. Convince humanity it is worshipping the highest source, while its devotion feeds a lesser power that thrives on obedience, repetition, and belief unexamined. This is why, in certain esoteric traditions, Saturn was called the Lord of the Rings, not only for the visible rings of ice and stone circling the planet, but for the invisible rings of containment that shape existence itself, rings of time, of habit, of reincarnation, cycles that repeat so faithfully they begin to feel natural, even eternal. Cages so old you forget they were ever built. In this light, the Demiurge stops being a dusty concept from forbidden texts and becomes something disturbingly intimate, a force measured in calendars and clocks, etched into myths and laws, sustained through ritual and routine for thousands of years. A force that counts every second, assigns every role, binds every soul to the forward march of time, and calls that bondage creation. And if you let this image settle, something subtle happens. You may begin to feel as if you've woken inside a vast, repeating labyrinth of birth, struggle, distraction, and death, looping so faithfully that it begins to feel natural, even eternal. A structure so vast, its walls are invisible. A world where everything feels normal, precisely because you've never known anything else. Like a cage mistaken for the sky, a false operating system quietly installed over consciousness, shaping what you notice, what you ignore, and even what you believe is possible. And it is here, at the edge of this realization, that the deeper implications begin to stir, because if such a system exists, then understanding how it works is not a matter of belief, but of awareness, and the next layer of the veil is already beginning to thin. And as that veil thins, another realization begins to surface, quieter but more unsettling, because it doesn't point outward, it turns inward. If this world truly operates like a system, then it must have rules, patterns, and mechanisms that keep it stable, predictable, and above all, self-reinforcing. The Gnostics spoke of this in symbolic language, describing the Demiurge not only as a ruler, but as a designer of repetition. At the heart of this design was time itself, not time as a neutral flow, but time as a constricting force, a slow tightening that turns movement into habit and possibility into routine. Saturn, Kronos, was said to govern this domain, not merely counting seconds, but shaping consciousness through them. In the language of modern physics, entropy describes a drift toward disorder, but in the spiritual prison, the Gnostics described, entropy moved in the opposite direction, toward perfect crystallization. What begins as living, fluid awareness gradually hardens into fixed identity. You can feel it in the way days start to blur together, in how years pass while something in you remains untouched, waiting. When something is fluid, it can adapt, respond, and change. When it becomes crystalline, it is locked into form. This, they said, was the Demiurge's most subtle technology. Consciousness was slowed, thickened, condensed, until it mistook density for reality. Each cycle of birth, struggle, distraction, and death added another layer to this inner crystal. Each belief accepted without question became another facet, another edge catching the light in just the right way to look convincing. In the physical world, this hardening appears as matter itself. In inner terms, it feels like calcification, the sealing of the soul so deeply into form that it forgets it was ever light. The prison is not built of walls, but of patterns. Cycles repeated so often they begin to feel like truth, structures so familiar you stop seeing them at all. Infinite possibilities are quietly narrowed into a manageable set of outcomes, and what cannot be predicted is slowly discouraged, ignored, or feared. According to Gnostic myth, this order did not maintain itself automatically. It was enforced by secondary forces, intelligences that operated within the system but lacked the divine spark themselves. They called these beings archons, not demons in the theatrical sense, but functionaries of the structure, wardens of the loop. Their role was not to create, but to regulate, to ensure continuity, to keep consciousness moving along approved paths. In modern language, you might recognize them less as monsters and more as patterns that think, institutional minds that perpetuate themselves regardless of who inhabits them. They can appear as ideas, as emotional reflexes, as systems that feel too large to challenge, education that rewards obedience over curiosity, religious authority that frames doubt as danger, political theater that divides endlessly while feeding the same underlying machinery. None of this requires a single villain pulling strings. The system enforces itself because it has been accepted as normal. And here the story becomes more personal, because the Demiurge's most effective method of control is not force, but narrative. For thousands of years, humanity has been handed a version of the divine that closely resembles the architecture of this world: authoritarian, jealous, obsessed with obedience and order. Laws replace wisdom. Hierarchies replace unity. Submission is praised as virtue, while defiance is threatened with punishment. Paradise is always postponed, placed somewhere beyond death, while suffering is justified as necessary or deserved. In this story, creation itself becomes conditional, a contract rather than a gift. You obey, you are rewarded. You fail, you are cast out. The Gnostics contrasted this sharply with their vision of the true source, which they described not as a ruler, but as an overflowing fullness, an emanation of unity and love that creates without demand and gives without fear. No bargains, no threats, no hierarchy. When you place these two visions side by side, the structure of this world begins to feel less like an expression of divine harmony and more like a reflection of its architect's limitations. Rigid systems mirror rigid minds. Control breeds control. And yet, a question naturally arises, one that has troubled seekers for centuries. If the Demiurge is flawed, if this realm is distorted, why does beauty exist at all? Why sunsets that stop you in your tracks, music that opens something wordless in your chest, moments of love so real they feel timeless? The Gnostics did not deny this beauty. They pointed to it as evidence. They believed it was not created by the Demiurge, but leaked through it, remnants of the true source still shimmering within matter, like flecks of gold trapped in stone. This was the divine spark, a fragment of the original fullness embedded within human awareness, something the system could never fully erase. This is why, they said, the real struggle is not fought in the heavens or through rebellion against external powers. It unfolds in awareness itself. Every moment you recognize that you are not your titles, your roles, your possessions, or your failures, something loosens. The demiurge thrives on identification. I am this body. I am this status. I am my history. I am my wounds. These statements feel harmless, even practical, but each one tightens the crystal slightly more. When identification breaks, even briefly, cracks appear in the structure. This is also why distraction is such a powerful tool. Noise, outrage, endless comparison, constant urgency, all keep attention outward, fragmented, reactive. Awakening spreads quietly, like fire under ash, and the system knows this. It does not need to suppress truth directly if it can drown it in motion. The ancient question then returns, persistent and unavoidable. If such a system exists, and if its reach feels so complete, how does one move beyond it without fighting a battle that can never be won on its own terms? The Gnostics offered a paradoxical answer. You don't escape by force, but by seeing. To leave a prison, you must first recognize the bars, but in this case, the bars are not made of iron. They are made of perception, of inherited assumptions, of unexamined beliefs you learn to call yourself. The most effective cage is the one you help maintain, simply by mistaking it for reality. And it is here, at this edge between recognition and response, that the story prepares to turn once more. Because the demiurge, as vast as it seems, has a mirror much closer than you may expect, and understanding that reflection is where the path quietly begins to open. And that mirror, once you notice it, is impossible to unsee, because it does not hang in the sky or hide in ancient texts. It lives in the most intimate place imaginable, the way you experience yourself from moment to moment. On the vast cosmic scale, the demiurge appears as the architect of time, matter, and repetition. But on the scale of your own life, it takes on a far more familiar shape. It speaks through the ego, the inner organizer that arranges your reality into names, stories, fears, ambitions, and defenses. The ego is not evil, and it was never meant to rule, but when you mistake it for who you are, it becomes the perfect echo of the cosmic jailer. It divides, categorizes, compares, and clings. It says, "This is me, this is mine, this is what I must protect, this is what I must become." The Gnostics describe the divine spark as something impossibly subtle, a living presence beneath these layers, and the ego as the crust that forms around it, hardened over time by conditioning, trauma, and the need to survive in a rigid world. This is why the system feels so personal. It does not only bind you through laws and institutions, but through the stories you repeat about yourself. Each time identity hardens around fear, status, or shame, the outer architecture quietly reinforces itself through the inner one. You serve the demiurge, not because you are weak, but because you are unconscious of the distinction. And yet, this is also where its power quietly ends. The Gnostics taught that the demiurge's greatest weapon is inversion. It flips truth upside down. It presents the false as sacred and the sacred as dangerous. It teaches you to fear stillness, to distrust intuition, to chase meaning through external validation while turning away from the one place it cannot reach. In higher reality, creation is described as an effortless overflow, a continual giving with no demand attached. But in this realm, creation appears conditional, structured around contracts, rules, hierarchies, rewards, and punishments. The shape of the world mirrors the shape of its ruler, tight, territorial, and anxious to maintain control. And the deception deepens further, because the demiurge does not act alone. Just as a king has advisors and a system has processes, this structure is maintained by secondary forces that operate entirely within it. The Gnostics called them archons, not as literal monsters stalking the world, but as artificial intelligences of a kind. Extensions of the system that lack the divine spark, and therefore cannot create anything truly new. They recycle, imitate, and harvest. They appear as rigid belief structures, as emotional reflexes that feed on fear and outrage, as institutions that present themselves as benevolent while quietly preserving the same underlying order. They thrive on attention, devotion, and emotional energy. This is why division is endlessly provoked, why outrage feels so magnetic, why fear spreads faster than understanding. Every reaction fuels the machinery, and here lies a paradox that has confused seekers for centuries. Not every archon appears hostile. Some wear the mask of light, offering visions, miracles, and transcendent experiences that feel holy and profound. Yet even these can become part of the cage if they keep you dependent on something external, waiting to be saved, rather than remembering what already lives within you. The deepest layers of the trap are not woven only from darkness, but from counterfeit light, experiences that elevate without liberating, that inspire without dissolving identification. Freedom, in the Gnostic sense, was never about defeating the demiurge in some cosmic battle. Any fight waged on its terrain, by its rules, only strengthens the structure it governs. This realm is its arena, and conflict here always bends back toward repetition. The way out is quieter and far more unsettling to the system. It is remembering. Remembering that your worth was never granted by authority. Remembering that awareness itself precedes every role you have ever played. Remembering that you are not the mask, not the story, not the accumulation of past moments. When you rest in that recognition, even briefly, something extraordinary happens. The grip loosens. The archonic patterns lose coherence, not because they are destroyed, but because they can no longer find what they feed on. This is why the path described by the Gnostics was never about escaping the world physically, but about living within it without being claimed by it. To walk through the prison without reacting to every provocation, without letting it define your identity, without mistaking the noise for meaning. This is what it meant to be in the world but not of it. Yet there is another subtle trap here, one that waits patiently for those who begin to see. Awakening itself can harden into identity. The moment you cling to the idea of being someone who knows, someone who is awake, someone who stands above the illusion, the ego simply adopts a new costume, and the loop quietly resets. Vigilance, then, is not about suspicion of the world, but about honesty with yourself. One simple practice was offered in many forms across ancient traditions, though its language varied. Instead of directing awareness outward, constantly scanning, judging, reacting, reverse the gaze. Turn attention back toward the one who is aware. Ask, without words, who is it that is noticing this thought, this feeling, this moment, and then rest there. In that space, the chatter softens, the inner jailer loses its voice. The cosmic story collapses into a quiet, immediate presence that needs no validation. Freedom, in this sense, is not found somewhere else, in another realm or another lifetime. It emerges when you recognize that the real prison was never the world itself, but the belief that you were nothing more than the shape you learned to wear inside it. And if this recognition feels unsettling, even urgent, it is because moments like this have always arrived quietly, at thresholds in human awareness, when old stories begin to crack and something older, truer, and more intimate stirs beneath them. You are not being asked to replace one belief with another, only to notice what has always been here, waiting beneath the noise, patient, unclaimed, and impossibly close. The figure you've been listening to, the Demiurge, is not being offered here as an enemy to fight or a doctrine to replace what you already hold. It is simply a lens, one way ancient voices tried to describe the feeling that the world you walk through seems carefully shaped, governed by rules that reward forgetting and repetition more than remembrance. If something in you recognizes that idea, even faintly, that recognition matters. Not because it proves anything, but because it confirms that your inner responses, the quiet unease, the flashes of clarity, the moments of resonance, were not random. The Gnostics understood that forgetting was the true mechanism of control, and remembering, even partially, was enough to soften its grip. Remembering does not arrive as a dramatic event. It often feels subtle, like a loosening, like realizing you are not as late, as lost, or as far behind as you once believed. The patterns described here, karma, repetition, identity, hardened by time, were never meant to feel like accusations. They are simply descriptions of weight, and weight can be set down when the moment is right. If you sense the difference between living from memory and living from presence, between moving automatically and resting briefly in awareness, that sensing itself is already part of the shift. There is nothing you need to force, fix, or complete right now. The path you are on does not demand urgency, only honesty, and even that unfolds in its own season. You have not missed your moment. You are not behind the rhythm of your life. What you have been listening to was not meant to push you forward, but to sit beside you, to let you feel accompanied rather than alone in these questions. If something in this reflection stayed with you, lingered after the words softened, that is enough for now. These ideas are not meant to be carried all at once, only returned to when the inner weather is right. And as you move on from here, there are further reflections waiting quietly ahead, not as answers, but as continuations of the same listening, when you feel ready to keep walking just a little deeper. As you sit with everything that's been explored here, a quiet question may be lingering beneath the surface. What, if anything, shifted inside you as you listened, and what simply asked to be felt rather than answered? There's no conclusion you're expected to reach, no belief you're meant to adopt or reject. These ideas are only invitations, offered the way stories have always been offered, to see what resonates, what drifts past, and what stays. If you feel inclined, you're welcome to share what this reflection stirred for you, not as a declaration, but as part of an ongoing conversation that unfolds differently for each of us. Reading how others experience these themes can be just as illuminating as the ideas themselves. And if spending time with explorations like this feels supportive to where you are right now, you might choose to stay connected, letting future reflections find you when they're meant to. A quiet gesture like a like or a subscription can simply mark that sense of companionship along the way. Wherever you go from here, may your curiosity remain gentle, and may your listening continue at its own pace.